This is the National Resilience Dialogue Series, a national conversation on how Jamaica rebuilds stronger. From the Higher Education Task Force for Disaster Resilience. And now, your host, Dionne Jackson Miller.
Thank you so very much for joining us for this important series of conversations, the National Resilience Dialogue Series. It's a series of 7 panel discussions we're having. As you heard, they're put on by the Higher Education Task Force for Disaster Resilience. And we are bringing together the brightest minds in academia, in the private sector, in the public sector, all with the aim of finding out how we can not just rebuild better after Hurricane Melissa, but how we can safeguard our country as we look towards other Melissas. And trust me, based on the science, it certainly looks as if they're coming. Now, this first discussion looks at the most obvious evidence that's left after a country has been hit by a Category 5 hurricane, as we were. We're talking infrastructure. What was the damage? What are the implications of the kind of damage we suffered? What do we need to do as we look towards June 1 and the start of another hurricane season, and then another, and then another? Joining us, we have a fantastic panel today. We have Dr. Christopher Burgess. He's Managing Director of CEAC Solutions. He's a registered professional engineer. He has over 25 years experience in civil, structural, and environmental engineering. His PhD was in climate science. How perfect is that? Dr. Omar Thomas with us as well. He's a civil engineer. He has expertise in transportation and civil engineering management. He's Deputy Dean of Outreach, Internationalization, and Marketing for the Faculty of Engineering at the UWI Mono. Mr. Dave Allen, another engineer, registered professional engineer, National Building Code consultant, and a lecturer at the University of Technology, Jamaica. And Dr. Carol Archer, Professor of Urban Planning and Public Policy at the University of Technology, Jamaica. Her areas of expertise include urban planning, public policy, and housing. And let me turn over to Professor Archer to give us a very brief overview of what it is we're doing here. You're on mute, Dr. Archer.
Thank you, Dionne, and good evening to everyone. It's an honor to be on this panel with my colleagues.
Okay, I think we got a little bit of glitch in Dr. Archer's stream.
I'd like to take the opportunity to force for disaster resilience. Okay, are you hearing me now?
We're hearing you now. Go ahead.
Okay. Yes, I want to take the opportunity to remind us of the Higher Education Task Force for Disaster Resilience, or otherwise referred to as HEDE. The Higher Education Task Force was formally launched in November 2025. It's a collaborative, multidisciplinary mechanism established to support Jamaica's recovery from Hurricane Melissa and to strengthen national resilience to future climate change disaster. It brings the combined intellectual and technical capacity of Jamaica's tertiary institution. It brings to bear these on national recovery and on long-term work of preparing the country for a climate future that is already upon us. HEDE unites 4 institutions: the University of the West Indies, the University of Technology, Jamaica, the Caribbean Maritime University, and the Northern Caribbean University. Around the table, we have experts across medicine, engineering, climate science, geospatial analysis, economics, and social recovery. HEDE is not academics talking to ourselves. From the outset, we have built this task force to work alongside government, to work with private sector and civil society. Recovery is not something university can deliver from the lecture theater. It happens when researchers, ministries, businesses, faith-based groups, and community organizations sit at the same table, staying there and working on solutions. That is the table that HED is helping to set. Our mandate rests on 4 pillars: technical analysis, policy advice, community engagement, and coordinated recovery and rebuilding support. Specialized subcommittees are already working on resilience planning and reconstruction. And we are deliberately extending into social and the behavioral side of recovery, because some of the hardest decisions ahead include possible relocation of vulnerable communities. And in this regard, we will have to build trust as much as we have to come up with engineering innovations. The bulk of our work is delivered through 6 specialized subcommittees that function as our think tank. They are infrastructure and reconstruction, social and psychosocial recovery, public health and medical services, and education continuity and academic resilience. The structure is deliberate. It means everything from engineering coastal improvement to addressing the trauma that a child from St. Elizabeth is faced with. And it's also about building trust so that Jamaica will remain resilient against future climate change disasters. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Professor. And I mean, I just loved everything you said there. I mean, the phrase, the climate future, that's already among us. I think that's something we always have to bear in mind. And I especially love the fact that you said we're not academics talking to ourselves. You know, this is no ivory tower business. This is real world applicability of the very important work that our academics are doing. So yes. I'm going to ask each of our guests, before we start with Q&A, I'm going to ask each of our guests just to, you know, say, having heard Dr. Archer, having heard Prof. Archer, what it is they see as the most important issue that we have facing us, and how this particular discussion is going to move us forward. Let me start with you, if I could, Dr. Thomas.
Yes, thank you, Dionne. I think one of the biggest problem is that we find that many buildings, many structures are still not being built to the required engineering design standards. This is largely due to affordability, also due to the general construction practice in certain areas, and also the level of enforcement that the relevant agencies are able to give. But I hope that this discussion will push the desire for us to have a higher level of construction standard, and a push for owners to not only design, or not only have the desire to design for everyday conditions, but we have to look to design for extreme events such as earthquakes, hurricanes. And so I hope that out of this discussion will be a greater awareness and a greater push in the industry to design and to construct to the required standards.
Well, when you talk about not building to code, I think that throws us directly into Mr. Allen's territory. So, Mr. Allen, you want to pick up there?
Yeah, sure. Yes, pleasant afternoon, right? Right, I support everything that Omar mentioned just now, right? And it's related to code. The truth is that for over a decade, probably close to 2 decades, there have been a great amount of voluntary service done by the Jamaica Institute of Engineers, the Institute of Architects, and other professionals and the Bureau of Standards in developing the national standards, and particularly the National Building Code, which prior to about 2009 or so, we did not have a national code, but in fact, the Act of 2018 empowers that code to be used. And so we do have codes which are done to international standards In fact, it's benchmarked on the International Code Council standard document. And so we have the codes. And for long in Jamaica, we speak to standards, and the standards are there. One of the greatest things that we have, that has beset us, is the matter of enforcement. And that, I believe, is where we need to strengthen the institutions that are to enforce the courts, particularly the municipal corporations, right, and the other agencies like NEPA, right, and so on. So these organizations need to be strengthened. And so, with, of course, we know a bill being passed in Parliament. We look very, keenly at what will happen, because it's my hope as well, as we go forward into the Senate, that some wisdom will also prevail in certain areas of that bill, to ensure that we have the institutions that are supposed to be the vanguard of safety in terms of environmental impact, that these are strengthened and not weakened in anything that we do. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Burgess. Let me bring you in. I mean, I know it's such a nuanced conversation, because the issue of building codes so important, standards, as you've said, but then on the other hand, we have people who say they can afford to build nothing better than the wooden houses in which they were living, and which many of which actually fell in around them during Melissa. So really looking forward to see how we take that conversation forward. Go ahead, Dr. Burgess, over to you.
Good afternoon, Dionne, and listeners and fellow panelists. I believe the question was, what do we see as the biggest problem facing us, correct? And moving forward, well, let me start by saying what I don't see as the biggest problem. I think the code is fine. I think the code is 98% perfect. What I'm most worried about is really two things, and I think they go hand in hand. One is, I'm concerned about those who remain fragile because of their land tenure issue. There are about 30,000 homes that were totally destroyed. Majority of them, 90% of them, essentially did not have secure land tenure. Nationally, there are 200,000 families that do not have secure land tenure, and tied to land tenure is fragility. They build with board house, not because they necessarily want to have a board house, but because that's what they can afford. And there's a very interesting article in the Star a year and a half ago, interviewing the man who builds a lot of these board houses in Westmoreland, and he tells you why he has customers and why people build with board house. But this is something which, I think it's the anthropologists and the politicians will tell you as well, in terms of why people have board houses. It's a land tenure issue. So the first problem, I think, is how are we going to replace or to help those 30,000 families that were wiped out in the first instance? But on a national scale, there's 200,000 families that live in these precarious situations. And if Melissa had gone down the center of the country the way Gilbert did, we wouldn't be dealing with 30,000 homes totally damaged. We'll be dealing with more like 150,000 homes. So that's the biggest problem I see facing us. We remain fragile. And when you look at the numbers, we're just as fragile as we were with Gilbert. And we have to address that. Added to that, if I could get a second bite of the cherry, Dionne, would be our institutional readiness for another hurricane. I don't believe we were ready for Melissa. Some would say, oh, we could never be ready for it. Well, I don't believe we'll be ready for another hurricane if it happened like that this year or next year. I believe that our disaster management systems are geared to responding to something more suited 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Instead, what we're coping with now in terms of another problem is that in the last 30 years, we have 3 times as many intense hurricanes per decade. And in terms of damage, we're experiencing 4 times as much damage, from 2 billion each decade to now about 8 billion a decade nationally. You can't respond with the same tool that you had 30 years ago. So that's another problem.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, Prof. Arch, I'm actually going to just dive straight into the Q&A now. And because your areas of expertise span so many of the issues we've been talking about. But let's start with housing. Dr. Burgess there gave us a really good insight into what the critical issues are. Tell me from your perspective now, how do we move forward on this issue? We've seen certain kinds of steps being taken. Are they the right ones? What do we do? What should we be doing now? Let's start with that.
So I fully endorse Chris's position to start with the issue of land tenure. Given our colonial history, that's an area that we have failed our people miserably. And if you look at the areas, Westmoreland in particular, that was most affected by Melissa, you will see that Melissa brought to bear the whole question of how we own and how we access land. So that has to be dealt with in a serious way. Because, for example, if the land I've settled on, I might not have the title for it because my grandmother died and never left a will, I cannot go to the local authority and improve on it using the process, because the process asks that I have a title to show. So we need to revisit our policy and our legislation as it relates to issues around ownership. The other thing dealing with the land has to do with resettlement, relocation. If you look across the Caribbean, in Dominica, in some sections of Barbados, they were able to enact legislation, implement policy to relocate persons who were affected. We have not efficiently and effectively implement relocation strategies. In fact, because of the work that is required, and we do have a relocation legislation, right? But it has not been properly applied because, for one thing, and that's another area that I'm most concerned about, at the community level, the institutions that are supposed to be in place, the community-based organizations, the community development committees, those have been disempowered. And so to work through and work with communities, a question of empowerment for access to land and to provide relocation services, those are non-existent. Then another point I want to make, and then we can move on, is in terms of the types of housing that and housing solutions that we are providing. There's the issue of affordability and adequacy. Affordability in the sense, and you know, I look forward to Chris's opinion piece in the newspapers, because he really highlights the question of affordability. What is it that the average Jamaican can afford? And we have been building units that the average Jamaican cannot afford. The adequacy of the units, the adequacy in terms of ensuring that you know, a family of 4 can be housed properly, that it is built in terms of the location, design to address issue of heat and so forth. So as it relates to land tenure, adequate and affordable housing, we need to concentrate our efforts going forward to make sure that the people of Jamaica, we are properly served by access to land and affordable and adequate housing.
All right, so land tenure issues, land ownership, 2, relocation and resettlement, and 3, affordable and adequate housing. But Dr. Thomas, the difficulty, I think, is that we have an immediate crisis. As Dr. Burgess alluded to, we have thousands of people who are in need of homes. No, land tenure is not a no solution. With the best will in the world, there are things that have to be done, there are surveys, there's committees, there's titles office. So how do we balance the need for housing now with the important initiatives and solutions that Professor Archer was putting on the table?
Wow, that's a very interesting question, Dionne. I mean, one of the things they need to look at immediately after disaster, many times persons are displaced, they're placed in shelters. I think there needs to be better planning as it relates to shelter accommodations immediately after disaster. We see where persons have been in shelters a long time. A lot of schools are being used as shelters. Schools are being open. And so I think going forward, as part of the disaster planning, I think the relevant agencies need to look at what are standard shelters, temporary places where persons can stay temporarily immediately after disaster. You want to make sure these places are secure. They can withstand earthquake loads. They can withstand wind loads. They're not susceptible to flooding. Persons should not leave their vulnerable accommodation and step into another vulnerable accommodation. And so I think this is one aspect we can look at in terms of the future planning, looking at shelters. Another aspect is looking at the whole transportation issue as it relates. You want to make sure that there is easy access after a disaster. And so I think the government has started some discussion where this is concerned. You want to make sure that certain classification of roadways exist. Even if some roadways are inaccessible, you want to ensure that there are certain roadways that will function immediately after disaster. So these are two areas I think we can look forward to planning as a disaster planning immediately after disaster concerning our current situation.
Okay. Better planning, re-shelters, and easy access for transportation. Okay. Dr. Burgess, let me come back to you. I don't know if you wanted to pick up on that housing question as well and the balancing of the needs.
Yeah, definitely, Dionne. And I don't want to give anybody an out, and you are the attorney here as far as I know. I'm not seeing where land titling needs to be a difficult or a long-standing issue or timely issue. I believe we can, if there's no dispute as to who owns the land and where they are, I'm not seeing where land tenure is an issue. And so I don't want us to say that's going to prevent regular formalization from going forward if there's no dispute. Give the people an affordable home. I see churches doing solutions for 1.5 million and 2 million. That's not a huge hurdle to pass. So let's solve the informal thing by giving them a home and entitling them afterwards. The 2022 registration of titles special provisions amendment, I think, makes it quicker. It's just for us to get the process going like LAMP did, in the past. They did 30,000 titles, I think, in a few years. I think we can get it done if we apply ourselves, yeah, and build affordable solutions.
Okay, Mr. Allen?
Yes, thank you. Right, I support that. With close to 1/3 of the population in informal settlement, right? It is a serious condition of our nation, right? It is not just simply those in Westmoreland who are building on land that they have no title for, and they clearly wouldn't build normally structures that would be of any huge expense, right? And so they would put up, very light type structures that, would not cost a lot. But we have quite a lot, I would say, of settlements, informal settlement across Jamaica, to the point, I think my last number when I checked it was in the vicinity of 900,000 per people who are living in informal settlement, right? And so what we really need is affordable housing for them, yes, but you also need, of course, as Chris mentioned, titling. But beyond that, government need to ramp up whatever system they have in place to maybe formalize. Is not a good way, but I know some time ago the Ministry of Housing have a particular unit that was, in a sense, formalizing these informal settlements. but it needs an aggressive push from government. We know about a year or two ago, maybe 2 years, we had something on TVG, I believe it was, that they looked at the housing crisis. And the crisis has only gotten worse with Melissa, right? And so government need to play a really big role in developing communities, right? That are sustainable in one way, because of course it is formalized. It has infrastructure where it can be policed. It has the capacity to take the utilities, right? And it also provides the opportunity for ownership of land, which of course gives some empowerment to people to build structures that are likely to meet the code. And of course, the code is another thing. But of course, the fact is that if you have nowhere to live, then you can't even put up any structure. So it's a real serious crisis, the matter of housing in Jamaica, the matter of affordable housing, even for the middle class, right? There is basically a serious problem. People are coming out of universities and they can't, in any reasonable horizon, consider when they will be able to own a house because the price is just way out of reach. And so that's a serious problem we're having in the country.
Yes, and in fact, if you talk to young people, it's one of their areas of despair. They just feel that there's no hope. Might as well spend my money on party because I can't buy a house, kind of thing. So before we move on to another area, I don't know if there's anybody who wants to make any other comment on this issue of housing. But what I would also love is perhaps an idea of how the work that the committee is doing, how best would that feed into these various solutions that you all are proposing?
Well, one of the things that I know the committee, the Higher Education Task Force and the subcommittee looking at the infrastructure and housing and land, one of the things that I know we have been charged with is to put forward some innovative solutions. And I look forward to working with my colleagues on some of these innovative solutions, because the truth is, I'm still on the matter of land. When we look at our legislations and our policies regarding land ownership, yes, we talk about titling, but that's a very expensive venture for the average person to have their land surveyed or severe, and to have it first registered. And so that's a very, the way we deal with land coming out of our colonial history. Individually, it's an expensive undertaking. I would welcome the research that would explore other options rather than the individual titling. Options such as community land trust, for example, which is one that was explored and found very viable in Puerto Rico, where the issue of individual ownership became problematic in certain areas, especially low-income areas. So they have the land being in trust, community organization, and the land being used as collateral collectively to build out at the community level. So I look forward to these sorts of research coming out to inform policies, to inform legislation, because the way that we do business is problematic at this time. Housing solutions and the different types of housing design and material used in housing construction. We have the ones that need to be tested. BSJ, I would imagine, is inundated. David, we can talk about that. How do we interrogate the different types of housing solutions available locally or even coming in that would be most appropriate? We need the research to begin to inform policies so that as a society we can all benefit and build resilience going forward.
Okay. The issue of transportation, Dr. Thomas, you had mentioned that. I'd love you to elaborate a little bit more in terms of what you were thinking and what you think we need to be looking at.
Okay, thank you, Dionne. So different roadways have different classification in the sense of, you know, you have your main arteries, you have your highways, and you have your local roads. So as part of disaster planning, you want to look at the community locations. You want to ensure that there is a high level of classification in terms of transportation access to as many communities as possible. This access may not necessarily be the shortest route, but you want to ensure that you have let's say, for example, a class 1 route that can access majority of locations, so that after a disaster, whereas say the class 2 or the class 3 roadways may be inaccessible, at least you know that your class 1 roads can have access to majority, if not all, the communities. And so this is future planning. All right, so it's not necessarily to fulfill the everyday need of transportation, but is looking at it as a holistic point of view, that in the event of a disaster, what are your escape routes? What are your routes that you will be using to bring the necessary assistance in? And so this is future planning in terms of planning your road network and your bridge network. All right, you want to ensure that the bridges are on these main roads above flood levels. Where some bridges may be inundated, you know that your disaster escape or disaster access routes are designed at a higher standard. And so I think there needs to be a more holistic view in terms of planning your road and bridge networks for disaster response.
Okay, so this then is the ideal time for that kind of future planning that you're speaking of.
That is correct. Yeah, it is correct.
All the work being done. Transportation, I see a look on your face, Dr. Burgess, like you have something on your mind you wanted to jump in on.
Yeah, something else to look at, yes, drainage and flood control, I agree, but I'm going to still back for housing should be number 1 in
Yes.
terms of priority. It had the most severe damage, and you know, at the end of the day, I find that institutions like NWA, JPS, etc., they tend to NWC, they tend to recover faster, quicker. You know, they have the resources, the professional manpower, etc. But you know, does anyone know how many roofs are back on in Westmoreland? I hear they are in St. James, South St. James, or in Black River. I hear there, whether it's 5 or 8 businesses that have reopened in Black River, 5 or 8 out of 100. You know, it's a small business people. You know, I'm concerned more about those who are most vulnerable. So, but yes, roads do need some attention. I saw several issues with roads post Melissa, you know, especially on the road between St. Elizabeth and St. James. You know, it was in terrible shape because of the lack of drainage, and obviously with Catherine Hall, the issue being flood control. At like any attention to road need to also take into consideration drainage and the associated flood control, so don't end up back with another Marcus Garvey situation.
Okay, that issue of roads, Mr. Allen, let me bring you in as well, because boy,
Right.
if you listen to any Jamaican right now, of course, whether it's dropping in potholes or the state of the roads or the roads being eaten out. And of course, we know in Western Jamaica, many of us saw it for ourselves, just the way the roads had been eroded, and which raised questions perhaps about how the whole way we think about coastal development. But let me bring you in on that thought.
Yeah, thank you, Dionne. Right. I support what Omar is indicating, because I don't think it is something that is really being considered in any serious way, right? You see, after Melissa, there's a drive to go and build back, but the build back seemed to be build back what we had, right? So in a real sense, in terms of disaster resilience, right, we need to think that kind of way, a way to say, can we ensure that our arterial roadways, a certain network that is accessible? Because yes, it is that we can't do only one thing. And so I'm thinking that with the significant spend that we are about to do, some monies really need to be allotted to reviewing the network that we have, the bridges, the roadways, and in fact, roads comes with drains. The challenge is that over many years, we have neglected the drains because of the expense. but it costs us in the long run. And so what really needs to happen is that the road network needs to be revisited in terms of the 100-year flood, right, in terms of design, and ensure that it takes into consideration what happened in Melissa, and ensure, therefore, going forward, that we don't repeat the same thing, and we don't have the same situation recur in terms of course, the inaccessible communities, because the roads have been made impassable by various things, whether it be trees or water. Thank you.
I know what we've heard from Works Agency, National Works Agency, and the ministry as well, is that we've had a national drainage plan for a while. We just haven't had any money to implement it. So we've heard, for instance, that the Spark program that's now underway, that's a road program that's now underway, that it's mandatory that the drains be put into those roads. So I guess we're going to see what happens there. But that issue of coastal development, though, Mr. Allen, let me just ask you to stay with that thought if you could, because we saw what happened in Black River. We saw what happened in some of the Westmoreland communities as well. As we're talking about rebuilding, restructuring, even the housing thing that Dr. Burgess doesn't want us to lose sight of. But do all of these discussions need to be put in the context of how do we develop along our coast? You know, are we too close? A lot of people have been saying that for years. Are we too close? Do we start to do more setbacks? Is this again the time to have those conversations?
It is indeed the time, and in fact, sometimes it is when you go through a particular experience, then you can look back and say that, because of course the engineers would have done their studies, right? And they would indicate where our floodplains, our hazardous areas in terms of building construction, right? So so the studies have been done. I can't say that there shouldn't be more, but the fact is that the building code refers to the areas in which ones are not to build, right? And you are supposed to build, right? And so therefore there's a matter of enforcement as well, right? And so it is that we are informed by our experience, but we also have the data, and that of course will support the information in the building codes that address areas which are prohibited from construction. And so I think in terms of coastal areas, there need to be an enforcement, but there also need to be a greater awareness, I would say, to indicate that these areas are not to be built on, and therefore we are enforcing the codes.
But that issue though, and it ties back to the issue of enforcement, and it also, what I'm going to ask ties back to the issue that Professor Archer was raising about the need to look at relocation and resettlement, because I've seen instances in which we have relocated communities, and whether it's a lack of enforcement or what, but you go back after a year or two and people have moved right back into the area that you resettled people from. We've seen it in Montreal, the railway lane area. We've seen it as well in St. Andrew along the Hope River. People had been moved
Taylorland.
Yeah.
Relocated as far as Yalos, and ended up just going back because they tell you my school is here, my community is here, my church is here. I don't want to be so far. Dr. Burgess, let me bring you in again, because that also relates to your housing concerns.
Yes. One of the points someone shared with me when they were a part of this whole relocation effort in the 80s and 90s for another situation was that people refer to where their dead are buried. They want to be close to their loved ones. And so you may relocate them, but there are other things that go with it as well. But I don't want us to get allergic to the coastline. I want us to frame it in the context of, if you're going to live near to the coastline, you can't live in the same way you live in, let's put it, less vulnerable or in areas that are exposed to less hazard. You have to build higher. You have to build a little stronger. And you also have to protect the shoreline as well. For example, in Black River, where the revetment was, the road essentially is intact. And areas in which there was no seawall, essentially you could see the road had disintegrated. And so in my estimation, if Black River had a proper revetment in place, and not saying something of the likes of Roselle or Palisados, I'm certain that there would have been a lot less damage. And so it's how we build and how we prepare. We're going to have to make the shoreline stronger. We have to live near to the shoreline. For example, there's a fisheries office in Black River. Where else is the fisheries office going to be in Santa Cruz? You know, it has to be next to the shoreline. And where are the fishermen going to go? They have to be on the beach. So let's make it stronger. Let's build appropriately. There are other codes which speak to how you build next to the shoreline and how you build along rivers. Catherine Estate was protected by a flood control berm. It just needs to not be breached, and it just needs to be higher so that the people can live safely. So let's not get allergic. There are engineered solutions for these things that, you know, it's not rocket science.
Dr. Thomas?
Yes, I support Chris and David. Oh, you know, we are a fishing country, we are a tourism country, and so we have to, you know, look at, you know, continue to look at the engineering solutions that enable us to live and occupy that space safely. Yeah.
But Dionne, if I may jump in here, I think the key to this, because we do have the engineering solutions, is how it is to be enforced, how it is to be maintained. We do not have, certainly at the local government level, where the bulk of the work in terms of enforcement is done. That is not being done efficiently. So someone come in with a design, it's approved. How are we ensuring that what is approved is being built? The enforcement is key. It is lacking at the level of the local authorities because the local authorities are not properly, they don't have the capacity, financial and human, to carry out the enforcement. The design and the maintenance of what is being built is also key for us to consider. So I would, and then finally, in addition to not being allergic to the coastline, as Chris said, we have to be some more proactive in carrying out what I would refer to as a spatial analysis. Where are our settlements growing? There was supposed to be, and I know we got financial support to do the National Spatial Plan that would help to inform the growth of our various settlements. Where are we with that? As far as I'm aware, that has not been done, and that would have helped to inform how do we retrofit areas that are expanding in terms of population and areas that are have lost population. How do we support those spaces in terms of ensuring that they are resilient and retrofit to adapt to the climate change impact? We need the science, and that's why I'm really happy for this task force, because that's what the researchers are to be charged to do. Get the data out there, be forceful to the decision makers so they use the information to inform policies, to inform projects, so that government money is used efficiently.
Has there gap?
Sorry,
there?
I just wanted to comment on the issue of enforcement. For some time now, I believe the professional organizations in Jamaica has been proposing that the private professionals can assist the government in terms of some level of enforcement. In other jurisdictions, the government or the government agencies hire private professionals to help with the inspections and enforcement, and I think this is an area that we can look into going forward as well.
I'm curious as to whether you found, and all of you are with the universities, has there been in the past a gap between the research work, which we know is there and it's solid, and policy implementation and development? And wow, Professor Archer, your face. If there has been, how do we know, try to build that gap, you know? Is the task force the bridge?
It certainly is positioning itself to do that. I think key now is to have the decision makers at the table and being actively engaged they should be saying to us, look, folks in the built environment, folks in medicine, what should we be doing? And we should be churning out. We have not been actively engaged to date, I can tell you, in getting to solutions. We are now positioning ourselves and we're holding the decision makers' feet to the fire. So I'm hoping for some positive outcome. But to date, we have not been actively engaged.
Okay, because Mr. Allen, you're coming in.
I think that the Ministry of Housing has been very quiet over many, many decades, right? We've had housing being addressed by, sometimes they call it a funding agency, the National Housing Trust. But housing policy must guide development, right? And of course, Carl spoke of a national spatial plan, and we're just moving without these things, and it is sad. But we really need those that are in, especially executive power, or the ministries, to begin to take on board the research that has been done, or actually reach out to the professionals for information and for guidance, right? Because really, we are in the housing crisis because there is no active work being done. I would probably say, go on record, I don't see active work being done through the Ministry of Housing in terms of deploying housing, right? So that is one thing. But we look at other matters in terms of, are they taking on board the thought that are coming out of the engineering fraternity, or the architectural fraternity, or the planning fraternity? Because it is not, I think, for lack of advancing these arguments, right? Because I've heard many years ago about a national spatial plan, and who is taking it on board, for what reason is not, right? So all of these will help, right, to move us forward and speak about the issue of relocation. But what I really think is that we need to have people at the center of everything that we are doing. If people are not at the center, then you won't consider that if you move this person from this coastline and put them 10 miles away, that they don't have a means of income anymore. How are you considering the thing as a whole, right, to ensure that people can live, they can survive? And so it is something that I think has to give sleepless nights to those that are in power, that we need to ensure that since people are at the center, what do we do, right? Do we call on engineers and say, as Omar might be saying, right, and Chris indicate, we can build in the water, right? But if we are saying, give us a house that can be along the coastline, what do we do? Do we need to put up revetments? Do we need to lift the house at a certain height, and therefore the people can live and the people can, have their means of existence there?
Just to jump in here, the UTech and UWI in 2009 drafted the National Housing Policy. We do not currently have the policy moving from policy to legislation. What I have seen is bits and pieces that we put in, and of course, policy have a lifetime, they have a lifespan. So we are now talking about the next iteration of the housing policy, when the one that was prepared, I was part of the team, that has not been moved to the various levels of the policy process, except for us handing it over to say, here it is, the data and the recommendations. We have not moved to that. And of course, the position on the National Spatial Plan. But yet still things have been happening without the empirical evidence to inform how we do things.
And have you said, because you said a little earlier that the task force is positioning itself to be the bridge to bring those two worlds together. So have you felt so far, or do you think the receptiveness is there, in fact, that will allow this process to move forward in the way that's been envisaged?
Well, I'm hoping that discussions such as this will prompt the decision makers to now come to the table in a meaningful way to effect change.
Okay, I just want to say, just before I continue, just to remind our viewers that you're welcome to just drop comments and questions in the chat as we go along as well. In a little bit, I will be going to any questions and comments we have. But bearing in mind what you all have said now, Dr. Burgess, we've seen Parliament has now passed a NARA bill, National Reconstruction and Resilience Authority, that's supposed to guide the Hurricane Melissa reconstruction work. Well, the House of Representatives, I should say, has passed the bill. It heads now to the Senate, and we see what happens there. From your perspective, how does that now fit in to this whole conversation?
You asked a question before if there was a gap between research and policy, and I think the bill, as it stands now, is the evidence of that gap. It, in my estimation, despite the call from both sides for trust and all the various things in this low trust society, in my mind, it denies the evidence and the experience that was gained regionally and even locally. And so, what was your question again, Dionne? Remind me as it relates to NARA.
I was just asking you because we can't have this conversation ignoring this tremendous
NARA bill.
This tremendously important piece of legislation. So I want to know how you see the discussion fitting with NARA.
I'm hopeful. It forces me, let me be very honest with you, when I saw what happened night before last night, it forces me to be ecumenical, to have faith and hope. Because that's really all that's left, is to hope that it works out better than I think it will. I believe that a lot is left to imagine if it will work. I'm going to be honest that if I had to bet money, I don't think when it's audited in 5 years' time or audited by a hurricane, I'm not hopeful that it would have moved the needle in terms of resilience substantially. And the reason why I say so is that it is missing the metrics as to how we build resilience. It's missing an approach in terms of weighing approaches by risk. It's missing all the things that our regional partners have learned and international partners have learned. But they insist that, as it's mentioned, it will work. We have no other choice as a people other than to just see how it pans out. And at the end of the day, the people will have to be the judge if it works out. Let me be honest as well that at the very least, in comparison to Gilbert, there is an act or a bill in this case to address the issue. After Gilbert in 1988, there was nothing to address what had happened. And so it should at the very least be better than Gilbert, but I don't think it will build resilience.
Okay, Dr. Thomas, your thoughts on moving forward on the issues you all have highlighted in the context of the NARA?
Well, I hope that in terms of the objective of moving quicker, it will address those concerns. But there's still the concerns of accountability and ensuring that, standards are being kept. But as it relates to quick response, we hope that the bill will do that, but will not compromise as it relates to standards and necessary checks and balances.
Mr. Allen?
Thank you. Well, it is very nervous. Well, I'm very nervous concerning the bill. I looked at it and there's a particular clause, right? A clause, I think it's 4F, but a clause F nonetheless, that says that the bill will, that the intent that the person that would lead this, I believe the CEO, will cause programs and plans to include standard specifications and requirements for the achievement of climate resilience by works to eliminate or mitigate the adverse effects of catastrophic climate events. And this clause, I believe it is well-intentioned, right? But it is vague, right? Because the matter of standard specification requirement doesn't guarantee that the National Building Code of Jamaica gets used, right? So as a building code consultant, this is something that is concerning, right? So it needs to have some teeth, right? And in coming to this discussion, I'm expecting that when this bill goes to the Senate, that they will now change those words, because cause sounds to me almost like a decree, right? A decree, a statement that says we will decree and see, all right? You know, it sounds like a divine power given without any substance of what or how it is hinged to something. So I'm expecting some change, something to the effect that to ensure that all programs, plans, and works are designed and executed in accordance with the National Building Code of Jamaica 2023 and any regulations made thereunder, and further require that design and construction supervision be certified by registered professionals carried under the Building Act of 2018. Right? It is something like this I want to see in the narrow bill that will anchor the bill to the consultant, to the engineers, to the design professionals, and to the building code in particular, because we do have a Jamaica National Building Code, right? 2023 meaning just came out, and we do have also a Jamaica existing building code, which addresses buildings that are already in existence and how we can retrofit them and ensure that. So it can't simply be, I believe, in this cause to say that the one in charge should cause. How can one person simply cause and it's not hinged to any code, any standard, any specific specification, which we do have to the international level. So I'm expecting those things to come out at the Senate level, because what we are seeing now does not gives us any comfort, right? That and there are other areas of discomfort, but just that for now.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like a second bite at the cherry, if you don't mind. It is vague. It doesn't have. It is vague, and the arguments that were presented that it was vague, or rather it was light, or that certain concerns were covered elsewhere. It leaves it to be bordering on vacuous. And when you look at the acts around the region that have learned from similar disasters, you see the level of detail and intention that you have no doubt what they're prioritizing on. That their electrical supply must be up in 3 months, that 90% of the homes must be resistant to such a category of hurricane or earthquake. You see the details as it relates to prioritizing informal housing. None of those things are specifically set out. There's no intention to transition this bill from essentially a reconstruction agency to a risk management agency, which is where other countries have gone to. So again, it is like reconstruction for now, very vague as to what exactly it's going to set out to do. The vagueness, they say, is intended to, I suppose, give it more width. But yeah, as somebody said, if you don't plan, you plan to fail. And that's what I'm sensing about this bill. Better than Gilbert, I think the approach will be, but I'm not hopeful that it will move the needle. And you know, it will be audited again by a hurricane. And I suppose all we can say at that point in time, whether it's 5 years from now or 10 years from now, is that, well, I guess it didn't work. You know, I'm certain there'll be some reason pro-offered as to why it would have failed, but at the end of the day, it's the people that will suffer.
Professor.
Yeah. My main concern with this has to do with trust. Because in our society, when you look at communities, when they said, okay, I'm not going to move, or I'm afraid to move because I don't trust, I don't want to go, I don't want, if I get in the relief, I want to get it from this agency as opposed to government because I don't trust. And then so you have the NARA bill, and civil society commented. And I think this was an opportunity for the government to say, let us have a reset on trust, because trust is so important in the whole disaster management, mitigation, and resilience building. And we've lost that opportunity, in my estimation, because whereas they could have, either through the HEDE or with the civil society coming forward and say, come, let us hear out some of our concerns. Let us have a quick dialogue about those concerns. So the trust that needs to be reset, because the government needs to reset that trust within the society. This bill would have afforded them an opportunity, but in my estimation, it was squandered. And simple step. Let's hear civil society. They have put forward some very serious concerns, especially about issues, environmental, climate change, impact, and environmental resilience. How do we do that? Let us see how we can take them on board. That never happened. Never happened.
As we mentioned, it is heading to the Senate now, and I don't know, perhaps the task force could think about putting together a submission from the Senate, drawing on this.
Well, sadly, even at the level of the Senate, and I know that was not the intent, but it has become so partisan in the approach. We saw where, at the House, Mallahu Ford took a position admirably so. I'm hoping that there are persons of similar mind at the Senate, but how we have practiced politics in Jamaica in recent times, I'm not as hopeful. And I think that if possible and if it can happen, I would love to be part to just have the discussion to show and to begin to at least push in a particular direction the decision makers to give reconsideration to some of the concerns that were raised as it relates to the NARA.
In the meantime, as we're visioning and planning and preparing, I'd love to know if any of you have case studies, best practices that you've seen, whether in the region or elsewhere, that you think we should be looking at as we go through this process. Dr. Thomas, for you, any?
Not particularly. I have been involved in some inspections as it relates to the damages that have taken place in Westmoreland and St. Elizabeth. So commenting on, what I may have commented earlier, when we did inspections, we found that, for example, many of these roof structures were under design, largely due to economics, undersized rafter, undersized wide spacing, and so, from an engineering point of view, we know that these were not designed even to standards pre-Melissa. All right, so even if a lesser storm was to come, many of these houses would not have withstand. And as David has said, the standards are there. If many of these structures were built to the standards pre-Melissa, you would not have seen the wide scale damage that we have seen. I know in other jurisdictions, there are standards as it relates to temporary housing and so forth. And so, given our culture and given our demographics, maybe we need to look at widening or fleshing out the standards as it relates to temporary structures and putting that more out there as a point of as a way forward as well. So those are my comments.
I'll like to comment on that.
Pardon me?
I was asking if you wanted to comment on that, the idea of standards for temporary accommodation.
Well, temporary structures are largely timber structures. The most I would say is we can look at design standards as it relates to timber structures. There are other temporary housing. So that's as much I would say at this point.
Right. And I had been asking whether or not for you there are any examples you say elsewhere, best practices or case studies that have really caught your eye, caught your attention that you think we should be paying attention to.
Not none is coming to mind right now. As it relates to that specific question.
Okay, not a problem. Dr. Burgess?
Best practices in terms of temporary shelter. Dionne, I just want to be clear in what you are asking.
Yes, my apologies. No, not necessarily temporary shelters alone. I mean, in terms of the gamut of the issues that we've been talking about here, in terms of the rebuilding and the infrastructure, whether it's a coastal development, you all have touched on housing.
Yeah.
You've touched on so many important points, and
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, what do we see when we look at?
I think certainly certainly Bahamas and Dominica would be good starting points. Creed in the case of Dominica and the Disaster Risk Management Authority in Bahamas. And both of them are not perfect, but I think they actually are more relevant than the Peru example that was chosen elsewhere and another one from New Zealand or wherever it was. Certainly Dominica shows you getting the framework correct, how to get the framework correct, the oversight, the detail. Dionne, they have a very simple set of guidelines for building homes back in both Bahamas and Dominica. And that is something which we could do with here, and which I think our Bureau of Standards should do, is to create a very simplified building code. Dominica is an example of how to get the framework right and to get most things right, except they didn't get the money part right. They lack the funding to complete their program. But you know what they have? They have an objective that 90% of their homes must be climate resilient and ready for the next major hurricane. They have a number in mind, and they're getting there. If you see their low-income homes, they look like our let's call it middle-income homes, and a low-income. They're building for their people. Anybody can go online and Google or YouTube low-income housing in Dominica following their hurricane. And then certainly in terms of the Bahamas, I like the let's call it the economic approach to recovery and to response, and how they have localized the response. So for example, in their system, it's the parish council that really leads planning for disasters and responding to disasters. And yes, there's a step-in clause, you know, in the event that the parish council is weak or not responding in certain ways, and the central government can step in. And I'd have liked to have seen NARA. They took 5 months to put these 16 pages or however many pages together. I think if that just done a little bit more digging, you know, maybe, and if the political powers wanted something more inclusive, that carries it to the local level to strengthen the local levels. What we've heard so often in the last few minutes about enforcement, how else can you strengthen enforcement other than strengthening the parish councils? And if you strengthen the parish councils to not only enforce the standard, but also to plan for and to respond to, with the help of the equivalent of an improved ODPEM, to disasters and to recover from disasters, then you have a stronger nation. Instead, what I'm seeing is something more centralized. I mean, I heard what the Prime Minister said about having one person as CEO so that nobody couldn't hide behind a board or not performing. But I'm not certain if that's the best approach to strengthen the country overall. You know, to have one strong CEO, one strong man, and, you know, 13 weak municipalities or 14, however many there really are. I think there are best practices regionally that we can learn from. And I think between Dominica and Bahamas, if they were to look at what actually happened on the ground, what is actually happening, their acts, the provision in their acts for responding and managing and planning at the local level, I think we could do better. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, Dionne.
No, it helps a lot. And I saw Prof. Archer nodding vigorously when you were talking about Dominica in particular.
No, absolutely, because I've looked at immediately, where else are we doing things in the Caribbean? As first as small island developing states, we have to draw from the experience. I also looked at you know, in the US, the Katrina, Louisiana, and New York for Sandy. And the key to those two is to empower the local city council. That was key. And we see similar in Dominica. They don't have the formal local government structure as we do. They have village councils, but those were empowered. In Bahamas, empowered local authority. In Barbados, similarly, in empowering at the community, at the local level. And they were equal partners at the table. What we have here in Jamaica is, in most instances, local authority serving as the implementer without being at the table or being bypassed altogether. And so I think we really can learn from the best practice. And, you know, we signed all these international protocols and, you know, UN Habitat, the new urban agenda, building resilient and communities. And all of those protocol speaks to empowering local government. We have not done so as it relates to disaster preparedness, management, mitigation, resilience. None of that we've really focused on at the local level, whether it's the local authorities or the community institutions. And the science is showing that's where we need to go, but unfortunately, we have gone opposite. We have good examples to pull from in the region and wider, but we have gone in the opposite direction. So you would have to question as a researcher, what else is informing this decision? If it's not the people, is it something else? And what is that something else? And I think as researchers, we need to come up with the answer so that society can see what is actually happening.
There was something Dr. Burgess said, if I could just go back to it quickly before we get too far from it, when you were speaking of a simplified building code. And I was wondering, how does that how would that relate to the code we now have, which, you know, we've been hearing since the beginning of this webinar, just how good our standards are, that our codes are good, that's not the issue. So does the idea of a simplified code now weaken that in any way?
I'm sorry, who was that for the end?
Let me let Dr. Burgess, since he raised it, and then definitely want to comment as
Yeah,
well.
so in the case of Dominica and Bahamas, their simplified building code / guideline, it's 20-odd pages, 30-odd pages, very pretty illustrations, very simple illustrations of how to fasten a roof, how to anchor the roof to the walls, how to build the walls, how to build the foundation. The thing that the man that visits a hardware needs to know. And one of the things I've been saying from the Institution of Engineers perspective is that what we need is a set of 6 posters in a hardware that when the mason goes to buy the concrete nails or the hurricane straps or the zinc sheet, there's a set of posters that he should see, and maybe a little pull-away pamphlet or a pamphlet in a box that he can take back to the site and say, Simasco said this is how we must fasten the sheeting to the roof. And that's what their simplified guidelines do. It offers that very simple understanding as to how to fasten the roof. When we look at the houses that failed, yes, there were formal houses that failed. We know about the ones that even the Prime Minister visited in St. James or Trelawney, and there are others that have failed. But the vast majority of the houses that fail are informal housing. And it's not a matter of well, it is a matter that they could not have afford, and they probably don't know how to fasten the roof properly to the wooden house. And board houses can work, you know. We found an example of board houses that work. They just certain elements just need to be a little bit bigger and also braced and tied together better. And we need to get that very simple information out of the building code and into the hardware.
Oh, I think I understand, you know. In other words, you're talking about more translating
Yes.
into layman's language.
The building code is perfect. It's beautiful. It needs very little updating. There's one aspect that needs to be updated, but by and large, I would not spend much effort on the building code. I would focus on how to translate it to the 80% of the people who were damaged in getting the information to them in a very simple form. Small videos, small pamphlets in the hardware, posters in the hardware. And I'm so surprised. I am befuddled. 4 months, 5 months since Melissa, why have we not produced any posters? There was a little social media influencer who 2 weeks after the hurricane, she did a wonderful set of videos. And I've mentioned it in certain articles, and the government with all the PR, all the money. I mean, GIS couldn't produce some simple pamphlets, some simple videos for the people who are rebuilding now. That's what we need.
Yeah,
But just to jump in here, I know there were several working groups where they actually produced, with the support of our international partners, they did produce simplified instructions, putting back a roof, use of and how to assemble the tarpaulin and things like that. So, but it was more targeted, more than sort of island-wide. But I agree with you that we do need the building code, and kudos to our colleagues who spent sleepless nights putting it. It was a good step. It's just a question now of implementation, enforcement, training, getting persons trained on the code so that they can enforce. Those are some key things that we need to do.
Then if I could have a third bite at cherry. When you have this roof program, why was it not put out in a roof program when you're going to collect the money? Here is a simple 6-page document with photographs as to how to put on back the roof.
All right, go ahead, Mr. Allen.
Right. I agree with Chris and with Carol as well. Right. The thing is that the code is an excellent document, but the idea is that you do need the man on the street, right? The who needs to have something, perhaps something called a construction guide. And there is some kind of a guide done some years ago by the Incorporated Master Builders Association, right? That is there. But some of the challenges that we face is how accessible are these documents, right? How are we reaching the people? And Chris mentioned even videos or other ways that you can actually inform them. All of this gonna cost some money because that social media person did it for free. But the government has all this money coming in, billions of dollars. Some amount of money must be allotted to training and to public education. And of course, pay people to develop these kind of videos or do these construction guides or stuff like that so that it becomes effective, right? One of the other areas that they need to take money is to spend money on the parish councils in training the officers to the level that they need. And some work has been done before. But what I'm saying is that anything concerning education, public education, marketing will cost something. And a program like this must set aside some funds to deal with that.
I mean, I think that's such a fabulous and important point. I see you coming in, Dr. Archer, 1 second. But I mean, I think the social media personality you're talking about, if I'm not mistaken, is Julie Mango, who
Yes.
Yeah.
I understand a trained engineer.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So for less than 0.03% of what roofs cost, you could have produced 6 of those videos. And I know that's what it would cost because we wanted someone like that to produce similar videos for us. But it takes $2, $3, $4 million to produce those videos professionally with the right information. But that should have gone out to the roofs. How is that money being spent now? Are the roofs going to be put on back the same old way to end up back? We already know that the money is about a third of what you need to put on back a roof. But okay, fine. With the third that you receive, how is it being put on? Why was it roofs, the program from Ministry of Labor and Social Security, not producing these videos or pamphlets to give to the people to build a better roof? It's very simple things in there. Spacing of screws and nails and raft straps, size of rafters. when we drove through the damaged area, we see everybody using 2x4. It's not every roof use 2x4. Some roof need to use 2x6. And it's not every time you must space the rafters 3 feet apart or 4 feet apart. Sometimes they need to be 2 feet apart. And these things are in the building code. It needs a communication expert to boil it down to 6 posters, one that cover sheeting, one that cover nail, one that cover hurricane strap, one that cover rafter, one that cover wall, one that cover foundation. And, you know, we will move the needle. The
Okay.
carpenters
Can I just jump in here?
in the local masons and carpenters, you know, the Joe coats, these are the persons that you need to learn how to do it right.
Go ahead, Dr. Archer.
Yeah, I just want to put a little fly in the ointment because all of that is, we need to do it. Absolutely. But to ensure just to remind folks on the enforcement side of it, to ensure that people are building to code, we need the regulations. We yet are without the sets of regulations for the building code. So when the officers from the local authorities are approving or going out to inspect, they technically don't have much to go on because there are no guiding regulations. So persons, you can't enforce it because there are no regulations for the enforcement. Just to put that in.
I want to stick in a little bit, if I might be allowed. So Carol said there's no regulation. Technically, there is none. This is simply because the regulation have not been signed, right? Because so they are done, and it's months ago that I hear, and I was flabbergasted, you could say, that the regulations are complete. They are now at some minister or a minister's desk sitting down to move. So the fact of the matter is that a lot of work has been done. The code is complete. The act is complete since 2018, right? And that is how long? That is, 8 years ago. And up to now, though drafted, the regulations remain in draft. And they need to be signed off on, right? Because Carl is indicated, because without them, you cannot bring to bear the sanctions that are carried therein, right? You can hold to some account, to some things, right? Because you reject certain development if they don't follow the building code. But what it is that you find people who are in breach, how are you going to sanction them? And the regulations are what is needed for that.
Okay, I had no idea of that, but that's something I think we can certainly follow up on in another forum and try to get some more information and maybe try and light some fires in appropriate places. Dr. Thomas, I haven't heard you for a little while on.
I concur with the simple way of portraying the building standards. Again, from my inspections in the West, I've also observed the wide spacing of the rafters, the undersized rafters, the lack of hurricane straps, and I've interacted with some of the contractors who are in the rebuilding process, and you have to communicate with them, to get an understanding. How are you going to build this back? And sometimes you don't. It's just by you questioning them, you get an idea of their construction methodology, and you're able to input. So I think the practical way or the simplified way of portraying the correct way of, say, building a roof. How is the roof strapped to the wall plate, the wall plate to the walls? I think that will go a far way in changing the culture of the construction techniques that are being used in the rebuilding process. The fact of the matter is, many persons are going to try and build it back the cheapest way, the simplest way, just to get a roof over their head, just to prevent rain from coming in, and not necessarily thinking that they're building this to withstand the next hurricane. And so there has to be a push to at least educate the persons. Listen, if hurricanes come, hurricane season come every year, and so this is a better way to rebuild, so that you can be resilient, and you just may withstand the next storm ahead. Thank you.
Okay, we're coming to the final minutes. I do want to Go around the room and ask very importantly, next steps, some of the most important things we need to be concentrating on, I should say, as we move forward. Prof. Archer?
Yeah. Well, again, the science is there, the universities, we have done the research. We now need to ensure, and some agencies have used it, for example, at NEPA in preparing the development orders. They have used the science and made recommendations as to where development ought to happen. Unfortunately, notwithstanding the provisions of the development orders, persons who are in position to make decisions, they have gone contrary to the provisions of the development orders. I'm wondering now how this sits with the NARRA. I'm not sure given the provisions there. But I think one of the things we need to have are the recognition of our technocrats, our well-trained technocrats, and what they bring to the table to guide the decision making. I don't think we have pulled on those technocrats enough to help to draft the policies, to help to move the redevelopment effort to ensure that we are building to prevent the impact of the next hurricane. I don't think we have called on the planners or the building inspectors in the parish council to ensure that when they're making those decisions, the recommendation for what to be developed, that they use the science that is there and that their decision is not being overruled by central government. That is something that we have to give serious consideration. The first trained, but they're not being considered.
Okay, right. Right. I think over the next 5 years, there'll be quite a lot of money being spent, right, under this NARA bill, right? And in one sense, we could say, in Jamaican phrasing, haste makes waste, right? And we also understand that those hurricanes are about speed, right? We can't sacrifice speed for soundness, right? And so therefore, it is that we have to now consider that if we are moving forward, we cannot divorce ourselves from the standards. The codes must be the benchmark, and in fact, the vanguard of a safe society in terms of the environmental effects of storms or earthquakes. So the fact is that I'm looking at it in that for going forward, we should ensure that the projects that we have, that there's an engineer on record or engineer off record that is placed there to take responsibility, right, for the structures so built. The other things which I mentioned earlier as well, the matter of regulations, right? The codes cannot stand, sufficiently alone without the regulation. And so with haste, we need the regulations to be passed, right, into law so that we can then be able to properly enforce that, right? And again, the other thing I believe I want to say is that we want to allocate some money, right, to training, allocate and to also marketing the codes, right, so that people, the common man in the street or the regular homeowner, know exactly what to do to build resilience. So that's my few points.
Thank you so much. Dr. Thomas?
Yes, I do support the public education for the layman going forward in terms of construction techniques, a simplified way in which the layman can understand the standards going forward. I do agree there has to be continued engagement with universities on the research side. How do we mitigate for the next, for the future? How do we truly build resilient? How do we plan in terms of mitigate against the effects of disaster, whether it be earthquake or hurricane? And so this leads to, what I recommended earlier as it relates to transportation, access, and it also, as I relate to the shelters, ensure that shelters are built to a required standard that can be a temporary, safe accommodation in the event of major disasters. Thank you.
Dr. Burgess.
Without repeating what others would have said, Dionne, I think we certainly need to focus on low-income housing and land tenure. It was the largest sector that was damaged, the largest damage. And so I'm hoping that NARA will give it primary focus, to move the needle. The truth is that we haven't improved our fragility since Gilbert. We're still essentially in the same vulnerable state. And so we need to, in 2026, move the needle. We also need to look at hardening our coastline where appropriate and our flood controls. Too often the same areas are getting flooded. I heard you say about an hour ago that we have flood control plans, drainage plans. You're right. We know what to do, and we just need to do more of them. I think maybe 6 of the 50 odd plans have been implemented after nearly 13 years. At this rate, that's kind of slow. We need to implement. Maybe this is the opportunity for us with the money that I've been hearing about. We can implement some of those flood controls. And finally, I think we all remember when communication was difficult after, and certainly we've heard a lot about JPS being down in the first 3 months after Melissa. We need to work on our energy redundancy and the strength of our grid. These are the same issues that were documented by the engineers of GIE after Gilbert, and they're coming back again to haunt us. Same shallow poles, same water treatment plants without standby power. And I think same hospitals without standby power. We can do better. And so I'd like for us to look at those as possible strategic investment projects under the Act, which, the Act allows for.
All right, just want to recap, just very briefly, remind people of the suggestions we've heard over the past 90 minutes. They need to urgently revisit the land tenure situation, look again at relocation and resettlement, as well as affordable housing, speed up the land tenure and land titling process. In fact, better planning for shelters, easier access to transportation, escape routes in terms of disasters, look at innovative solutions from other jurisdictions, such as community land trust, as well as revisit the suggestion of having professionals helping with enforcement activities, the importance of this task force in bridging the gap between academia and policy development, the need to link building standards, which are the general consensus is that they're excellent, or building standards, link those building standards and codes directly to NARA, the national entity for reconstruction and resilience. Perhaps look at standards for temporary accommodations. We're told, don't be afraid of the coastline. We need to look at building for specific areas, looking at specific accommodations. Also strengthening parish councils so local government can lead in some of these important areas. Really, really important point, I think, of simplifying aspects of the building code, putting it in layman's language to educate the public on some of the very basic things they can do to make the housing that is being built as we speak, whether we like it or not. People are not waiting on government to do stuff. People are doing their building. We need to be educating them as we go along. And on that note, that brings us to the end of this first panel discussion in our National Resilience Dialogue series being put on by the Higher Education Task Force for Disaster Resilience. Thanks so much to our fantastic panelists for this first series. We've had with us Dr. Christopher Burgess, Managing Director of CEAC Solutions, also Dr. Omar Thomas from the University of the West Indies, Faculty of Engineering, Mr. Dave Allen from the University of Technology, and Dr. Carol Archer, also from the University of Technology. I'm Dionne Jackson Miller. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you look out for panel discussion number 2.